Welcome to Utopian Horizons.
Hello and welcome to Utopian Horizons, a podcast where I cover a different utopia or dystopia in each episode. This is the second part of a conversation I had with Sarah Lohmann on Ursula K. Le Guin's novel, The Dispossessed. I'm guessing most of you listening to this will have heard the first part, so that's fine. But if this happens to be the first episode of Utopian Horizons that you've come to for whatever reason, then you'll probably want to listen to the first part of this conversation first, as we're going to be kind of jumping in halfway through. So yeah, it'll make more sense if you go and listen to the first part of this conversation first. This is the first podcast that I've recorded since sort of launching the new Patreon. It's very nice to see that some people have signed up for it to get access to the bonus episodes I'm doing. The first episode I've released on there is on utopia and music, featuring a number of people on there. Those of you that listened to it seem to have really liked it, so that's nice to hear. I hope some more of you will think about signing up on the Patreon and checking that out. And to those of you that have signed up, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it, and I'll try and send you the little Utopian Horizons badges that I owe you as soon as I can. There's another bonus episode available now as well, or in the very near future. Obviously, I'm recording this episode a few days before I release it, but the bonus episode is already ready to go, so I'll release it at the same time as this one. Is the plan. So that's on a video game called Not Tonight, which is kind of a Papers, Please-ish game about bouncing, and very much a game about Brexit. So I kind of use it to talk a bit about Brexit and the politics around that. So yeah, if you're interested in hearing that, then go to patreon.com/Utopian Horizons and you can sign up and get access to that, as well as the episode I've already done on Utopia and music, and an episode next week on the first episode of Cowboy Bebop as well. That's coming. That's already recorded, and yeah, I'll release that in a week or so. I'm not going to try and push the Patreon again too hard this time around, because I'm guessing pretty much all of you listened to, as this is part 2 of a 2-part, I'm guessing there's probably not any or many new people here. But just to say again, as I mentioned before, I'm trying to keep up. This next few weeks is going to be a bit more of a regular schedule, hopefully, in terms of there's pretty much 2 episodes a week at the moment in terms of these normal episodes and the bonus ones. That's kind of to give people a bit of a taste of how I'd like the podcast to be if I could get some more support on Patreon, sort of justify putting more time into the podcast, because yeah, making these episodes does take a lot of time and effort. So yeah, that's all I'll say about that. Thank you for those of you who supported me, and for those who haven't got the cash or don't want to support me, if you could think about giving me a review on iTunes, that would be very much appreciated as well. But yeah, nice to see that some of you have signed up, and nice to see that you're enjoying it. Yeah, I think that's all I really need to say here. Now we're going to jump back into the second part of my conversation with Sarah Lohmann on The Dispossessed. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to talk to you about that I think is a really interesting, important aspect in this book, obviously the subheading is an ambiguous utopia, and there's a lot of imperfection in it. You can tell already, like the conversation we had at the beginning of the podcast, we kept saying, oh, it's meant to be like that in principle, or like sometimes it goes like this, but you can already tell that like sometimes not everything goes as it's supposed to. So there is clearly imperfection here. So I want to talk about that and like the value of that. The first thing obviously is we talked a bit about this, is Anarres is a very harsh world. Like when you think of utopia, like the first thing you would probably think of is like, some perfect world where everything's green and lush, and there's loads of abundance, we can have everything we want, blah blah blah. This is a society where like survival is really difficult. It's like basically a desert world. Survival's a constant struggle. There's no animals, save for like I think maybe like insects and stuff. There's a part to the novel where there's a drought, so there's like a really bad period of years where it's a question of whether the society's even going to survive. So yeah, I just wondered if you had any thoughts about why Ursula Le Guin has made this utopia like a place of scarcity and difficulty, where it's a real struggle to survive.
Yeah, so I think that actually the fact that it is such a just a difficult environment is really useful to the exploration of utopia here, because if you already kind of like assume the worst possible conditions, then like if you have a social system that doesn't function unless the conditions are perfect, then that's, you can immediately throw that out, right? You need something that's actually adaptable to all sorts of different conditions, and if you have the worst possible ones to begin with, then that's ideal for testing whatever system you have, right? So I think that the fact that this environment is so incredibly hostile is actually a really great way to show how it could still survive and thrive, and it does to a certain extent. And Shevek also says at one point, it's the only thing that can work in this particular environment. He says, what is idealistic about social cooperation, mutual aid, when it is the only means of staying alive? And another point, he also says, it is our suffering that brings us together. It is not love. So like the very harshness of the environment is what makes this system of, like different allocated work postings, etc., function, because everyone's pitching in, right? Everyone's doing exactly what needs doing. There's no kind of selfish behavior standing in the way of the community. On the other hand, you could look at something like Ian Banks's Culture, that's very much post-scarcity. So it's very much at the other end in terms of the preconditions for the society, and that they have absolutely everything that they want, and they do also have this kind of liberal anarchy, and but that functions very differently. So they're so privileged in terms of the technology that they have, and no one has to do any menial labor, etc., that they've actually decided on a very different system where a lot of the work is done by like the physical work and also mental work by AIs that are the non-human minds. And so that functions very differently, but it's also an anarchy. So it's also an anarchist system. So it's interesting to kind of compare the two. But in this case, it's tested by the harshness of the environment. And I think that's actually quite nice, just like the most basic bare conditions.
I think something you said earlier about, you mentioned the thing with the blanket and how like it took that way and put the focus on the relationship. I think that's also something you get out of this kind of world as well, is like the focus is on how people relate to each other and like what the structure is of the social relations, not about like what you have. So like creating that literally being in a desert like gets rid of everything and lets you focus on like how the structure works, if you know what I mean. Yeah, absolutely. And also what I like about utopian literature in general is that you can think of these novels as thought experiments, and the more basic a setup you have, I think the easier it is to actually see the effect of the factors that you're changing within the society. So if you start with something that's just incredibly basic, don't assume that anyone already has any kind of like elevated starting point to go by. Then you can look in the most bare bones way at how the society develops and what actually happens. And so I think that's really quite nice. And I haven't seen it in quite as much starkness in other novels. And then also you can focus on, other things that can go wrong that come more from, the people themselves, right? So of course there's the bureaucracy that kind of poisons the anarchist system on Anarres, and also like human fear of failure and otherness and difference. But those aren't, I wouldn't say that those are meant to kind of show that this kind of society doesn't work. I think those are, again, just like means of testing it, right? Mm. They're just like, well, okay, well, what can happen? Let's just kind of throw different things at the system, different situations where things can go wrong for reasons that don't really have anything to do with the utopia itself, and we'll just see how it copes. Mm. Yeah, I wanted to just sort of give a few examples to people. We hinted a lot at stuff not like working out. So just to give a few examples to people. So there's stuff like when Shevak first goes to the university on Anarres, he notices that they're having dessert every night, and he says like, "Oh, that's rare. Everyone else," and he's been taught everyone was equal, and he's like, "Oh, well, this calls it calls things. I mean, it's a small thing, but it calls things into question for him." I mean, worth saying about that, like, so this hints that things might not always be as they should be, but some people have got extra dessert, right? It's not like it shows you that there's like an imperfection there, but it doesn't like mean it's not like the exploitation of you have extreme like billionaires and like people like some people have extra dessert. So it's kind of acknowledging that. You also have stuff like there's a guy called Sabor who's a professor at university, and he realizes that basically he hasn't done any original work. It's just that he can read Iotic, the language of Anarres, and he's basically translated stuff without acknowledging it. And he puts his name on Shivak's paper to get credit for work he hasn't done, basically. So again, we have this idea that there's not hierarchical power, but we see Sabor exercise it. We see, even though we talked about this being a feminist society, but there's a scene where there's a guy who says to him, women want to own you, like they want property, men want freedom, women can't be true Ordonians, like forgetting the fact that Odo was a woman, of course. So it that shows you that like people can still be sexist, but again, it's worth noting like sexism's not there like structurally. So I think there's something quite useful. So I think she's in this book, you're constantly seeing these things where we've talked about this overall theme of individual versus like collective, and that there's a whole like it constantly returns to that. Like one of his friends called Bid Up. I don't know. He talks about how like public opinion's basically like a power structure. Like we've talked about how people will shame you perhaps if you don't. You can do what you want, but you may like be seen as an outcast or shamed, and he talks about that being like a controlling thing. So we're constantly being exposed to ways in which the society might not be as perfect as it should be, or as a principled. But I think what's really important of it is it's never like a gotcha moment, like an anti-utopian thing. Like, you see, like utopia is always going to be corrupted because people are going to do it. It's like it still really is a utopia in some sense, but it has this nuance where it wants you to see these flaws without that calling into question like the fundamental principle of utopia, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So I think again, like I think that some of these things are really, you can see them as kind of strengthening the overall idea of that particular utopia, because they're just like, throwing a wrench in the works and just seeing how the system copes, right? But so, for example, I think a really important way that that's exemplified is again environmental. So, for example, these kind of ethical conundrums that people sometimes find themselves in that are caused by there just not being enough for everyone, and just and like having to make decisions between like who gets extra rations and things. So, for example, I think the dessert thing is kind of like either that's someone's selfishness or it's connected to this ration idea, and they definitely have that during the drought. That like at one point Shevek has the job of kind of allocating work to people, and he's given full rations, and then other people are given half, and then people who are already ill get a quarter ration, and that's very clearly, I think, kind of intended to kind of control the population like towards the stronger ones surviving. So if someone's already ill, then if they're only getting a quarter ration, then they might well die. And that's kind of intended by the system. But the thing is that, again, it's not a personal thing. Like this is something, it sounds incredibly harsh, but this is a system that everyone kind of decided on to begin with. And they're all just trying to find the most fair way of running their society, even in emergency situations. So of course, ideally, everyone will always get the same amount of food to eat, etc., and the same opportunities. But sometimes you just have to make these decisions because these very harsh kind of moral decisions, because the society has to survive in whatever way. Or there's another story where there's a train driver who's bringing food to another community, and then his train gets stopped by some people on the tracks who haven't had enough food, and he has to decide basically where the food goes, and he ends up like backing his train into the crowd and like killing some people, and feels absolutely terrible about it. But But again, it was basically him deciding that, the system was right in deciding that the food in the train was meant to go to this other particular community. But again, that's when you end up with these like really extreme philosophical thought experiments like the trolley problem, and then you have to end up deciding, whether utilitarianism is the correct way to go or whatever. But these are decisions that these people are regularly making for themselves within that community. So I think what's actually quite interesting there is within this basic anarchist system, because the only thing that they're all committed to is the principle of mutual aid, I think they have the freedom actually to make those individual decisions about how best to reach that aim, right? So the train driver is a part of that decision-making process. Shevek is part of that decision-making process in that he decides to give up the post where the rations are unfair in his mind. But of course, it's, someone else will take up that post. But still, like, it's to a certain extent, these people are invited to have input into what is the best way of doing things. And of course, like, the way that they run these communities is through communal decision making. So anyone, like, if there's something that's really not working out in the system, like, anyone is welcome to complain about that and maybe get it changed. So again, like, there are some very harsh tests to how the system functions, but it's not, that in itself isn't a flaw. In fact, it's something that ultimately, ideally would show that the basic system already is a good one that just needs tweaking. And like we were saying earlier, that also needs to, adapt to change and like be constantly growing and not growing, but constantly evolving and changing in accordance with the change that's already happening within it.
I think that those imperfections are, I mean, you talked about a lot of those like difficult decisions and moments where the system's tested. And again, I'll say, like, it's again like provocative, which I think is one of the things that fundamentally makes it a utopian novel, in that it wants you to take a critical perspective. It wants you to like be a utopian and think about the problems inherent in these different systems, or potential problems, whether this thing's better than that thing, how you could adapt it, how you can change it. Like, it wants you to take that position. I think the other is something that something that I talked about. I think in my second episode I had Peter Fraser on to talk about his book Life After Capitalism, and he talked about the problem of utopias being like boring, like in terms of the old utopias, the traditional utopias where everything is like perfect and everything, and that presents a problem narratively in that it can, there's no conflict, there's no story, there's nothing interesting. And so that's obviously a benefit for this book, that it has a narrative, because there are conflicts, there are problems that need to be overcome. I think if we want to imagine Anarres as something that could be feasible in some way, it feels more realistic, and it's something that we can easily imagine when it is complicated and messy, and there are problems that people have. But also this idea, Peter said again in that episode, like the idea that in utopia, conflict will disappear is fundamentally problematic, and we need to think about, if, for example, you take away money as like the organizing force, that will remove that kind of conflict. But then you have other kinds of conflict that it will find out, and envy will still exist. It will just be structured in a different way. And yeah, again, that's something I think is really effective about this book, or what makes it effective as a utopian novel, is that these imperfections, it's like you said, they are testing these problem cases. They are still showing conflict there, right? How do these conflicts resolve themselves? That's something that we need to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like you were saying, like, it's both kind of on the level of the narrative that, that this utopia deals with different problems and kind of overcomes them. And I was talking about environmental problems, but then of course there's also, the, like individual human failings, like you were talking about Sabu, and then also how the whole kind of PDC becomes kind of rigid in how it works, and then that in itself kind of leads to like just less human freedom for individuals. And so all of that does contribute to the narrative being more interesting, because you're seeing the utopia dealing with different problems. But then also, I think this basic, so the whole point of my thesis at the moment basically is that I'm trying to say, look, there are utopias out there that aren't boring, and the reason they're not boring is because they because they're looking at how utopia can be sustainable and dynamic, and then I'm using complexity to try and explain that. So I'm basically saying because a complex system is inherently dynamic, and some of these critical utopias can be read as complex systems, that in itself makes them super interesting. And of course, the way that that manifests then in the narrative is that they'll have, for example, like, you know, time travel, or like in the case of the Dispossessed, there's also, you know, there are all these different chapters that alternate between being set on Eurus and Anarres, and that in themselves kind of like with kind of going backwards and forwards in time between the different chapters, they also kind of demonstrate the cyclical nature of time alongside the linearity that Shevik is trying to demonstrate in his general temporal principle. And then also, you know, at the very end, like the penultimate chapter is set right before he goes to Eurus, and the very last chapter is right before he arrives back at Anarres. So there's this kind of sense of like constantly being like leaving and arriving and never being really settled. And also the fact that the ending itself is open, like we don't actually know what's going to happen. And so Le Guin herself actually said in her foreword, is quite possible at the end that both Shevik and Ketho will be killed on arrival by an angry mob. It's only too likely that Shevik's specific plans and hopes for his people will come to little or nothing, and that would not surprise Ketho. But yeah, so there's definitely the sense of we can work towards something better, but not only will we always have difficulties to combat, and we also won't know whether we're ultimately successful, but in fact the only way that we could ever begin to be successful is by incorporating, you know, unexpected developments and change and organic growth. And so I basically think the Dispossessed and the other critical utopias largely are a new kind of utopianism, in that they head on kind of deal with the fact that any utopia or any utopian impulse must always have dynamism and growth and complexity at its core, and that is then not boring.
Yeah, sure. So one other thing I wanted to talk about was the way the book uses perspective. That's quite an important part of it. I mean, as we said, we've got two worlds, so they obviously contrast, they're obviously different perspectives. We have the perspective of Shivak on an alien world. We have the perspective of how the aliens react to him. We have our perspective on the two different worlds. And it's quite interesting the way that works together. One of the things that I think the novel's quite effective at in terms of using those perspectives is thinking about how it highlights the way that ideology works, or how what you might describe as like an anti-utopian impulse in terms of thinking of certain things as like natural and just the way things are. One way this manifests, you have the conversations that he has with the doctor, and that, you know, they're talking. This is his first encounter with someone from another world, and they're asking each other questions. And he talks about asking a question, and the doctor ends up like floundering, and he says each took for granted certain relationships that the other could not see. I think that's basically talking about, you know, the power of like estrangement in science fiction, like this idea that I've talked about estrangement on the podcast before, which I'll try and explain again, I suppose. You know, basically this idea of you come into contact with this other world that you might struggle to understand, and that has the effect of bringing you into a new perspective that can denaturalize your assumptions.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's like built into this book. Like, obviously, I think that's how science fiction works in general. But that idea is there. That's something that's inherent to what we're seeing in Shivak's perspective. If you see what I mean, this idea we're constantly seeing people having predispositions or assumptions that are being knocked down in surprising ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you know, Darko Subin basically says that that science fiction is necessarily founded on this interaction between between estrangement and cognition. So you know, taking something we know and making it strange, and using the novum, this new element that kind of forces us to see our reality in a different way. And so I think that Shevik actually is, again, just this personification of estrangement here, and that he literally leaves his own planet and then like looks back at it and thinks about it from a different point of view, having engaged with Eurus, and vice versa. So he's always kind of taking a step back and changing his own perspective in order to understand his reality better. Oh, and also, actually, fun fact: did you know that that Darko Subin was the first reader of the Dispossessed?
Oh, nice.
Yeah, he. I read in Le Guin's introduction to the novel. She said, "Thank you to Darko Subin, my book's first reader and first critic, and also that he was very useful as a Marxist, apparently."
Okay. Well, that might explain that.
Yeah. So, So anyway, so this idea that Shevek already sees himself as an outsider in this world that is completely communal. So in a way, he's actually a really good guide for us to understand this utopia to begin with. But then also he literally leaves the utopia and looks back and has this vantage point that really makes him not only a good utopian guide, although of course he subverts the tradition of the utopian guide that takes us to utopia. Instead, he leaves a flawed utopia to go to a place that some people see as utopian and we then end up seeing as dystopian. So he's already completely upending that narrative convention. But still, he's just in this really great position of introducing us to both of these worlds, and then also even other worlds. And again, like this, I think this openness of the ending is another way of kind of keeping of not delving too much into the familiar, like we're used to, or we enjoy having endings that kind of tie everything up nicely. And apparently that's initially what Le Guin had for this book, but then Darko Subin told her not to do that.
Okay.
He said you have to keep it open, and I think that's really good, because because that in itself is estranging. Like we don't have access to the ending. We don't know what reality is like at the end of the story, but then all we're left with is the process. All we're left with is our own interpretation, our own estranged view of our reality, and the possibilities inherent in that. And I think that's actually a really exciting place to be, even though it's kind of frustrating. And again, it just underlies the fundamental necessity of an openness of a system that is to be sustainable.
Okay, so just one final thing. There's a nice quote in there from when he meets one of the working class revolutionaries on Anarres, on the capitalist society, and he says to him, "Do you know what your society has meant here to us? They can never say it's a mirage, an idealist dream." So I just wanted to ask you what you think the value of this book and the Utopia of Anarres is for us.
Yeah, so I think so like I was saying before, that I think that utopias in particular are really nice kind of vessels for thought experiments, because you can change these different factors and then see what happens. And it's a nice kind of meta thing that Le Guin is doing here, and that she has that estranged utopian effect not only between the reader and the utopia, but like within the universe in which this utopia is set. So she already has again the estranged perspective, not only of Shevek regarding these different worlds, but also of the people who have been observing Anarres. So in a way, the people on Eurus are stand-ins for the reader in comparing this utopian society to their own, and thinking about how their lives would be different if they lived in a world like that. And but also just like having this intimate engagement with these ideas by seeing them played out in a way. So what they benefit from is this immediate engagement with Shevek's actual physical presence in their midst, and then literally being led to revolution by Shevek. But again, ultimately we don't know what's going to happen there, because that society again on Eurus is, even though it's similar to our own, it's not the same, and it might not even change at all. And like there's this impulse there, but we don't know what it leads to. And one of the fundamental things that Shevek learns in the end is you can't bring Anarres or the idea of utopia to other people. You have to let them come to you, right? And so I think that's a really important point there. Again, coming back to the idea of complexity, that you can't force anything. You can't force a social development. You just need to make sure that the material is out there. You need to have communication set in place, right? It all comes down to kind of having these open systems that encourage discourse and learning and just communication in general. And I think the Ansible also stands in for this idea of communication. And once you have that, and this is one of the, I think this book is so important in all of, Le Guin's kind of Heinisch material set in this universe, that it's the point at which the universe opens up, at which these different planets are really able to engage with each other because they start having this literal way of communicating. But even if you, through the Ansible, but even if you didn't have something like the Ansible, I think what it comes down to metaphorically is just this idea of engaging with one another, of actually listening to one another. And I think that's basically what literary utopias do, is they don't force their views on anyone. They just kind of throw some ideas out there and just, hope for the best and just kind of see how people will react. And I think that's a really interesting way of getting people to engage with their own society, by just being like, hey, what if we just imagined that things were quite different, but still fundamentally connected to our own world, just different in very specific ways that maybe we could also imagine adopting in our own society, but maybe not, depending on what works at any given point in time. And so actually there's been some criticism of the Dispossessed for actually for being too perfect, or for being too optimistic. And so John, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Fikit. So he says that total harmony and total transparency are the fictions behind Chevik's illusion that a healthy society would and could coordinate all its individual peculiarities, and that Le Guin retains the rationalist dream of unitary cohesion. But I think actually, if you see Anarres as something that is ultimately only going to be successful if it incorporates, the kind of change and complementarity that Chevik brings to it, then it's a living, changing organism, a complex organism, and that can never be. You can never really see it in terms of like everyone being perfectly coordinated or this kind of unitary cohesion, because both of those imply something that is static. Whereas if it's meant to be successful, it's never going to be static. It's always going to be shifting. It's always going to be improving. So I think just the very kind of back and forthness of the novel, the kind of the dialectic that underlies it, I think that in itself just like really nicely illustrates this utopian impulse that is always dynamic and that's always kind of adjusting if it is to be sustainable, and but just is very open to this idea of experimentation and just, throwing something out there for us to think about, and just, playing around with different ways of doing things. And so I think as a utopia that is this kind of thought experiment that makes us see our own reality in a different way, I think The Dispossessed is actually really interesting and not at all, closed off and boring or anything that you would expect from a traditional utopia. So I think absolutely that is the value that it has and should have for us, as this utopian impulse, and just makes us think about just the very nature of utopia and the processes and systems that could lead to it or are inherent within a better world, in terms of this openness, especially in terms of communication complexity and just a holistic dynamic worldview. So, and I think, that's what makes it really interesting and absolutely worth reading. And I really enjoyed myself.
Yeah, it's great. It's in terms of like explicit utopian novels, I think it's one of my favourites, if not my favourite. So yeah, I definitely recommend people reading it.
Yes.
So that's a nice place to end. So thank you very much for joining me, Sarah.
Oh, thank you.
Is there anything else you want to mention? Is there anything you want to plug or anything? I don't know.
Can I just plug one thing, and that is, this is not at all like an event or anything like that or a thing, but just to reiterate again, I think that The Dispossessed is a really good example of this batch of utopias, these critical utopias that are also, I think, essentially egalitarian, and feminist from the late 60s, early 70s, that really kind of demonstrate to us like what a utopia can be, and that I think can also really change how we think about utopian literature in general, and also just totally kind of change the meaning of the word utopia. So it's not something that's either completely idealistic or so idealistic that it's not even worth thinking about, but actually is something that can be engaged with in different ways, and that can be just like that's much more about the process and the impulse than about having a very specific static system. And so basically I just want to plug these critical utopias, so the Dispossessed, and also Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time, and Joanna Russ's The Female Man, as just completely new ways of doing utopia that can even now, many decades later, that we can really learn from, and in terms of thinking about how a society can become better and function sustainably. And I think especially right now where so many things are going horribly wrong, I think that's really important to keep in mind. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from those novels, and they shouldn't be ignored just because they've been branded feminist utopias, because actually they're super interesting and useful and worth reading.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. So that's the end of this 2-part episode on the Dispossessed. I hope you've enjoyed it. If so, again, please consider checking out patreon.com/Utopian Horizons to see what rewards you can get on there, and you can get access to some more of this stuff. You can hear the bonus episodes that I'm producing, the 2 that are already there, and more that will be coming. And you can get a badge as well, so who can resist that? As always, you can get in touch with me if you've got any questions or any feedback or suggestions or anything else on utopianhorizonspod@gmail.com, on Twitter @Utopian Horizons, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Utopian Horizons. Something I didn't say at the beginning was thank you to those of you that have given me iTunes reviews. I forgot to mention that when I was asking for them. And yeah, I'd really appreciate it if you could think about giving me a review on iTunes if you've been enjoying this podcast. I will be back in roughly a week with the next episode. It's on the video game Snatcher, and Trevor Strunk from the No Cartridge podcast, which you might be familiar with, is joining me. So yeah, that was a fun conversation, and look forward to you hearing it. Thanks again. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye.